Spain allowed about 400 Sephardic Jews living in Salonika, Greece, refuge, a tiny proportion of the Jewish population of Salonika. Francisco Franco initially allowed about 7,500 Jews who escaped from France into Spain. When Franco closed the borders to war refugees and escaped POWs, Winston Churchill pressured Spain to reopen the borders. Spain did serve as a transit place for Jews from France to get out from 1940 to 1942. As many as 30,000 Jews reached Spain by 1942 and another 5,300 by the end of 1943. The total number of Jews saved by entering Spain from 1940 to 1945 was 40,000. Sweden had a small Jewish population of 7,000 in 1938. The country allowed small numbers of refugees to flee Germany. About 3,000 Jewish refugees got into Sweden. During World War II, Sweden took in about half of Norway's small Jewish population that fled across the border, and all of the Danish Jews able to escape, about 8,000 people. By the spring of 1944, the total number of Jewish refugees in Sweden was 12,000. In Switzerland, the chief of the Swiss police, Dr. Heinrich Rothmann, required that in 1938, Jews entering Switzerland should have their passport stamp with a J. From 1940 to 1942, Swiss authorities deported anyone entering the country illegally. This blocked the route of escape for thousands of Jews from France. However, from 1933 to 1945, Switzerland admitted about 300,000 refugees, of which about 30,000 were Jews. This included about 1,500 Jewish orphans from France in December 1943. 1,685 people on a rescue train from Hungary in 1944, and 1,200 Jews released from Theresienstadt concentration camp in February 1945. Switzerland tried to limit the number of Jews it accepted, and when the Germans appeared to be winning the war in 1942 and 1943, deported any refugees it caught entering the country illegally, although some Jews managed to be smuggled into Switzerland by the Jewish and French underground in France and Jewish organizations in Switzerland. By the winter of 1944, Swiss policy changed, and they allowed any Jews who could escape into the country to stay. Even Rothmann noted that, quote, "We are taking the effort to save the remaining Jews very seriously." Turkey did not allow Jewish refugees into the country, but agreed to provide protection to about 10,000 Jews of Turkish origin and their children in France. Turkish consuls provided the Jews with documents that protected them from deportation, and in one case a Turkish consul went to a train carrying Jews out of France and held up the train to save about 70 Jews of Turkish origin. On the Greek island of Rhodes, Turkish protection saved about 50 Jews. The Turkish government did allow the smuggling of Jews through Turkey to Palestine during World War II. After initially refusing to permit transit via Turkey in 1940, the Turkish government agreed to permit transit visas in February 1941, as long as escaping Jews spent no more than 2 weeks in their country. Turkey was never a refuge for Jews during the war, but it looked the other way at activities of Jewish organizations and Zionist groups from Palestine, using Turkey as a transit point to move Jews illegally or legally to Palestine. As early as 1937, Haganah emissaries from the Jewish Agency in Palestine went to Europe, working with Zionist groups to smuggle Jews into Palestine. In 45 sailings, the Haganah, the Mossad, and the revisionist Zionists managed to transport 26,000 Jews from 1937 to 1939 out of Europe. During the war, the Jewish community in Palestine attempted to save European Jews by aliyah bet, the illegal smuggling of Jews. From September 1939 to the end of 1941, 15 boats carried 12,000 Jews to safety. The effort stopped in December 1942 with the tragic sinking of the Struma off Istanbul, with the loss of all but 2 of its 769 passengers. Small numbers of Jews managed to escape from Romania in 1942, but an organized effort to rescue Jews did not start again until 1944. Another operation started in Tehran, Iran, succeeded in smuggling about 1,400 Russian Jewish children to Palestine in February 1943. In 1944, the Mossad smuggled out about 4,700 Jews from Romania in 10 ships, although one sank, the Mafkura, with the loss of 400 people. In 1944, about 1,700 Hungarian Jews were smuggled out of Hungary into Switzerland, and in the largest Mossad operation of the war, 8,000 Bulgarian Jews were transported to Palestine in 1944 and 1945, and 1,200 Romanian Jews were taken out of the country to Palestine in 1944. In Hungary, the Zionist underground youth movements managed to produce fake documents that saved some Jews and allowed others to escape to Romania or go into hiding in Budapest or other parts of Hungary. British Jews endorsed efforts to bring in some refugees during the 1930s, especially the Kinder transport. But after the Night of the Broken Glass, concerns about too many refugees from Germany immobilized the British Jewish community. Internal divisions between Zionists and anti-Zionists in the two leading British Jewish organizations prevented British Jews from taking an active role in pressuring the British government to take action to save Jews after September 1939. Widespread anti-Semitism in the United States, divisions within the Jewish community, strong public support for immigration restriction, and President Franklin Roosevelt's reluctance to take any meaningful action on refugees made it difficult for the Jewish community to pressure FDR to take action. In 1943, Hillel Kook, also known as Peter Bergson, worked with an American Ben Hecht to stage a demonstration and commemoration at Madison Square Garden on March 9, 1943, to publicize the Holocaust, hoping it might lead to action to save European Jews. A few months earlier, in December 1942, Rabbi Stephen Wise of the American Jewish Congress and several other Jewish leaders met with President Roosevelt to ask for a plan to help the Jews of Europe. But FDR carefully dodged any major obligation to act. When the producer Billy Rose tried to approach the president about the final solution and the proposed Madison Square Garden event, the advisors to FDR advised against it. They did not want to support raising the visibility of the genocide, since it might lead to questions about the American response. FDR refused to endorse the demonstration or attend because of his busy schedule. About 20,000 people showed up for the meeting and performance about the Holocaust, and another 20,000 showed up at a second showing. It was performed in other cities, and 100,000 people saw it, including 200 members of Congress, 6 members of the Supreme Court, and Eleanor Roosevelt. But it failed to lead to action. Jewish groups did not pressure the president for further action. However, Secretary of the Treasury, Henry Morgenthau Jr., commissioned a report about the lies of the State Department about refugees allowed into the United States and the efforts to hide information about the Holocaust. This forced FDR to establish the War Refugee Board in January 1944 to encourage the neutrals to save Jews. The largest operation of World War II to save Jews took place in Hungary in 1944-1945. Until 1944, Hungary, while a German ally, had refused to deport its Jewish population or the refugees who sought protection. This changed in the spring of 1944 when Adolf Eichmann went to Hungary to start the deportation of the largest surviving group of Jews in Nazi-occupied Europe. On June 25, 1944, Pope Pius XII, for the first time, intervened and sent a cable to the Hungarian government not to cooperate with deportations. President Roosevelt and Sweden's King Gustav also appealed to stop the killings. Briefly, the deportations were stopped, but efforts to allow Jews to leave for Palestine were blocked by the British and the United States and the United States refrained from making any commitment to allow any Jews allowed out of Hungary to come to the United States. Instead, they suggested neutral countries. This delay prevented Jews from getting out of Hungary, and more pro-Nazi government came to power that resumed the deportations. Over 450,000 Hungarian Jews would be murdered. However, the Hungarians did agree to allow special passports for Jews protected by foreign governments for immediate deportation. Sweden granted 4,500 by the end of the summer of 1944. Other countries that granted passports were Switzerland, 7,800, Vatican, 2,500, El Salvador, 1,600, Portugal, 700, and Spain, 100. The most important foreign representatives trying to save the Jews of Budapest were Charles Lutz of Switzerland and Raoul Wallenberg of Sweden. After the Arrow Cross staged a coup and took over Hungary, representatives of neutral countries sent the new government protests against continued deportations. The most important came from the Papal Nuncio and the Swedish ambassador on November 17, 1944. The Hungarian government agreed to create a special ghetto for Jews under neutral government protection, and about 33,000 Jews received protection. Before the Germans could deport the Jews in the so-called Big Ghetto, the Russians arrived. About 120,000 Jews in Budapest survived, while another 120,000 were murdered by the Germans and their Arrow Cross allies. Raoul Wallenberg emerged as a hero, a righteous Gentile, but his fate remains unclear. The Russians arrested him and he vanished into Russian custody.